All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our second live online virtual Q&A session for BuyerFest 2020. Once again, I would just like to mention that I wish we could be all together in person, but there's always next year, right? For now, we can be together on the computer or app or over the phone. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today. A few items before we get started. We have a few options for asking questions. If you're using your computer or tablet or phone, you can use the chat function to ask a question. You may also raise your hand by clicking the button on the bottom, and we will unmute when we are ready to take questions. We'll also have an open opportunity for everyone to ask questions at the end, and I bet we'll have plenty of time for everyone to ask. So, just a little bit about Roger Styer, who is joining us today. Roger works with greenhouse growers around North America and allied industries, putting together growing programs, technical guidelines, and short PowerPoint presentations for greenhouse growers and companies. Roger loves to work with growers on site to review growing programs, problem solving, training, and trials, and has extensive experience with plant nutrition, growth regulators, insects and disease control, biocontrols, young plant production, environment control, crop scheduling, and growing programs. The presentation Roger Styer provided is called Using Plant Growth Regulators Properly for Best Results. This presentation is still available to view on the BuyerFest app, as well as Carlin Sales website through our YouTube channel. So Roger, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. We received a couple questions from customers and Carlin staff prior to this event when they watched your presentation earlier this month. If you don't mind, we'll go through those questions first, and then we'll open up to everyone on the floor.
Okay.
So the first question is, are temperature, water, and light the best means of controlling plant growth, or are PGRs the most effective?
Well, I would add, besides the temperature, water, and light, I'd add your choice of fertilizer to that also, because some fertilizers are going to promote plant growth and some fertilizers are going to help you slow down and tone the growth. But when you're really thinking about this question, you have to consider it. This is like gas versus brake. So some of these conditions can be gas, promoting the plant growth, and some of these conditions can be brake. So when you're driving a car and you want to make it go, you put it in gear, but you put your foot on the gas pedal. When you want to slow it down, what do? You take your foot off the gas first and put your foot on the brake as needed. When you want to stop the car, you put your foot on the brake all the way. Too often, growers are having the pedal to the metal and trying to put the brake on at the same time, and that brake typically is PGRs. That's why a lot of times the PGRs don't work very well, or you have to use higher and higher concentrations to do the job. So I always try to get growers to think about taking their foot off the gas as much as they can, and your brake, your PGR will work more effective, and in some cases you don't even have to use it. So think about this. Temperature, when you have temperature that's warmer temperatures and you have a big positive diff between day and night, the plant's going to grow rapidly. So if you want to slow the plant down, you want to start dropping your temperatures, or you use a negative dip in the morning. When you're looking at water, you try to dry it down as best as you can without wilting. That's going to keep the growth under control. When you're looking at light, you want to increase the light levels so that that plant has enough light to be sturdy and have good root growth. Low light conditions tend to promote more top growth. When you look at nutrition, fertilizers high in ammoniacal nitrogen and phosphorus are going to tend to promote the shoot growth. So you're using 20-10-20, you're going to get more growth. So take your foot off the gas. Use a fertilizer like 13-2-13, which has high nitrate nitrogen as well as calcium and magnesium. It's not going to promote your top growth so bad. So again, keep in mind what's gas, what's brake.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is, what pesticide plant growth regulator interactions should growers be concerned about?
That's an interesting question. I would just say, okay, first off, you know that you need 7 days between a B9 and a copper fungicide application. Okay, 7 days. If you put them too close together, you're going to get a phyto. All right, so B9 and copper, keep them 7 days or more apart. The other thing that you have to maybe be concerned about is if you're going to be doing tank mixes, where you're using a pesticide and a PGR at the same time, are they compatible in the sprayer tank? And then the other aspect of that is the water pH in your spray tank. So some of our PGRs, like obviously Floral, has to have a very acidic water pH, 5.0 or below. And a lot of your pesticides do not want to be that low. So generally, you want to keep pesticide water pHs 5.5 to 6.5, although some of them, like conservatives, do better at 7. So how you do tank mixes, I know a lot of growers like to do tank mixes, but you really got to be concerned about, do they mix well, and what interaction they'll have on the plant. And some of that goes back to, are you going to spray this, or are you going to spray them separately? Are you drenching them? And so when you're doing these aspects of it, I usually like to keep pesticides and PGRs separate. I know it's more work, but at least I have better controls over what I'm doing.
Sounds good, thank you. Next question is, if my poinsettias are not sizing up and I want to give them a boost, will I stop bract formation and coloring?
Generally, no. So if you're asking this question at this time of the year, or in October, most growers will do a spray of fascination or fresco at 3 ppm to get some more size. You can also continue to use fertilizers like 20-10-20, which have more ammoniacal nitrogen, while your weather is still conducive for this. Okay, now up in Minnesota, your weather starts cooling down pretty quick. So usually I tell growers up in the north, by the time you hit October, you really don't want to be using any 20-10-20 anymore. The other aspect of it is temperature. And so when you look at your average daily temperature, that controls your leaf unfolding rate. So if you can give yourself a warmer average daily temperature, you'll speed up the leaves coming out, which is what's going to also show you up as size. The other aspect of that is trying to keep a positive diff, a warmer day than night, which will give you a little bit more distance between those leaves, which also shows up as size. So keep an eye on what you're doing with your temperature. Use the fascination or fresco. You can also do fresco as a drench, and generally that rate is somewhere around, can be anywhere from 1 up to 3 ppm. And then also your choice of fertilizer while you still can. But you have to also understand, why are they not sizing up? Okay, was it because you hit them with too much growth regulator, in which case the fascination is going to help? Were you late on planting them? Is the root growth poor? Because a lot of times, poor root growth, you don't get good size. And then going back again to what light levels you're using. So you want to try and be, at this time of year, you should be at 5,000 foot candles easily. And so if you still have shade on the plants, take the shade off.
All right, thank you. Next question is, what are some of the most common oversprays and how can they be corrected?
Okay, well, my favorite one is bonsai sprays where they drifts onto begonias. If begonias even smell bonsai, you will stunt them, and possibly forever. So if you're spraying something like impatiens and they're next to your begonias, you are guaranteed to get bonsai overdose on the begonias. I've seen it also, bonsai overdose on pansies and dusty miller, other crops that are sensitive to bonsai. So what you try to do is, these crops that are sensitive to bonsai, you want some separation from the crops that you are going to spray. And a lot of that goes down to how you lay them down in your greenhouse to begin with. So if you are not thinking about this, you're going to end up with crops, mismatching of crops due to their growth regulator applications. It does not matter how well you spray. If you have begonias next to impatiens or begonias next to petunias, you are going to get bonsai drift, which is what a lot of guys now have gone towards drenching. They will drench bonsai rather than spray it because the drenches can definitely get right to the crop. They don't have to deal with the drift going on to crops that are sensitive to it. So again, how you lay down the crops, avoiding a mismatch of a bonsai sensitive crop next to a bonsai requiring crop, and maybe looking at some early drenches at a lower rate rather than sprays. I also have seen problems when guys are using cyclocell or B9 cyclocell, and they're not watching carefully how they apply it in the crop. I'll use geraniums, seed geraniums as an example. You can actually get too much cyclocell if you overlap your sprays. So you have to be careful with how you're spraying and making sure that people are doing the sprays correctly to avoid any kind of these oversprays.
Excellent, thank you. That was the end of the questions that we received before the presentation. We'd like to now open it up to anyone else. Feel free to use the chat function in Teams or just let us know you're here, and please feel free to ask your questions.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep, good morning, Chris.
Okay, wonderful. A quick question. In the presentation, Dr. Styer, you had mentioned that coverage is key here and that the method you spray and how you spray is vital. And I mean, it's my understanding spraying really is an art and how you get thorough coverage. And you mentioned at one point that you need to get the stems on certain things covered, not just the leaves, and you alluded to the concept of sprenching. How vital is that? And is that because of these plant growth regulators, are they translaminar usually, or how do they really get taken up, and how important is it to make sure you have that really perfect spray coverage?
All right, let's go back through how these plant growth regulators get into the plant, okay? So you have a group of them that take 3 to 4 hours to get the majority of the chemical in. That means they have to stay wet on the plant to get the majority of the chemical in. That's your B9, cyclocell, Floral, fascination. Those are the ones that you have to keep the leaves wet for 3 to 4 hours to get the majority of the chemical in. Then you have another group that gets in within 30 minutes, and that's your ARES, your Bonsai, your Sumagic, your Top Floor. So if you make a mistake with those growth regulators, you're not going to be able to rinse them off or get rid of that effect. Now, having said that, you also have growth regulators that if they get on the leaf, they don't move to the growing point. But if you get them on the stem, they will move to the growing point, which is where you're trying to get the chemical. So Bonsai, Sumagic are two chemicals that you have to hit the stem in order to get the movement up to the growing tip. If you only hit the leaves, they do not move to the growing tip. So when you're spraying Bonsai and Sumagic, you need to get to the stems, which is hard when the plants are bigger, because to try to get that coverage, you end up using more and more volume, which now means that you end up having some of that just dripping right down into the soil, which now starts to function more like a drench. So if you're going to do that, you might as well just do a drench. Whereas ARES, you spray the leaves, it'll still get into the growing tip. So does B9 and cyclocell. So you have to consider that Bonsai and Sumagic are more difficult to spray because you have to hit the stems. And if you hit the stems too much, you get a lot of dripping down into the soil, and you're going to start to get a greater effect because It's going to function as a drench, and you're using a higher ppm to do that job. Oh, another thing, Floral, you have to get thorough coverage of the plant because Floral does not move in the plant. So if you only sprayed one half of the plant, that's the part that's going to have the Floral action in it. The other half won't have any action. So Floral, you need to spray the whole plant. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes. Thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions from anyone?
Hi, I have a question. What do you mean by diff?
Diff. Diff is the concept of the difference between day and night temperature. This has been a concept that was developed quite a few years ago at the University of Minnesota by Roel Hines and his group. And that's basically what we're doing when we're growing in a greenhouse. We have warmer days than nights. And that tends to promote more stretch between the leaves, okay? When we can run night temperatures warmer than day temperatures, we get what we call a negative diff. That actually controls that stretch. So a positive diff, warmer days and nights, promotes that stretch. Warmer nights than days controls that stretch. So we've taken that concept because usually it's costing you more money to try to heat more at night than it is during the day. We've taken that concept down to what we call a negative dip, DIP, in the morning, where we will drop the temperature, say we'll drop it 10 degrees Fahrenheit from what we were running at night at around sunrise. And we'll keep it there for about 3 to 4 hours. And then we'll let it warm back up to our normal daytime setting. So that is where the plant is most responsive to that negative diff. 3 to 4 hours is easy for us to do because basically we can open up the vents or we turn the heater down to where we can get that 10-degree drop. I would not go more than a 15-degree drop is as much as you would want to go because you can actually start to chill the plants. But a 10-degree drop, some guys will go 5 degrees, whatever you can do is effective for controlling the stretch between those leaves. All right, and that's a very good technique to use on poinsettias because you lessen how much growth regulator you have to use if you can use something like a negative dip. All right, so again, the difference between day and night temperature. When days are greater than nights, you have positive, you get more stretch. When you have nights greater than days, it's a negative diff and you'll control your growth. Or if you're going to use a negative dip in the morning, you'll control your growth. Does that answer the question?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
And Dr. Styer, the Spartan in me is saying that I think Royal Hines was Michigan State, if I'm not correct, not University of Minnesota.
And all his grad students just took off and went to all the other universities. I was thinking of John Irwin, who is now at Maryland.
Yes.
So how did that happen? Why did John leave Minnesota? He was there a long time. Yeah, anyway.
Who knows why they all hop around and do the different things out of the different floriculture departments.
Okay. All right, other questions? Feel free to ask it. There's no dumb question, only the one you don't ask. I just want to reiterate one thing. That's the gas versus brake concept. If you as a grower can understand how much gas you're putting to those plants, you'll understand how to take the gas off the plant, okay? So if you're more of a wet grower, and typically growers that are new to the industry tend to be wet growers, they are definitely afraid of their plants drying out and wilting and dying. So they will tend to water them more frequently. watering them more frequently contributes to more stretch and soft growth. It also tends to contribute to more diseases. So as a grower, you're learning to become a drier grower, not a dry grower, because dry growers can typically also lose plants because they let a lot of the edges get too dry, but a drier grower. So the better you can know how far you can take the plant before you need to water it again is a good way of being able to control the growth. Humidity is another aspect that you have to think about, because the higher the humidity in the greenhouse, the more the plant stretches. So if you're growing in a Quonset, double poly Quonset, single poly Quonset on the ground, you are growing in a humid greenhouse, okay? If you're growing on benches, it's going to be less humid. If you're in a greenhouse with cement floors and high gutter heights, you're going to be less humid. If you're growing under glass, you're growing under even less humidity and higher light. So when you start throwing baskets over top of crops down below, you are changing not only the light quantity, you're going to change the light quality. And I think I mentioned that in a talk, but I want to emphasize that again. Growers typically are trying to grow more and more baskets. Yeah, free space. Basically, a lot of growers think that is. But let's say you're growing in a Quonset and you've got a crop on the ground and you're going to throw baskets over the top of that. There's not much difference in space between that basket and the crop down below. As that basket starts to grow more, you're going to reduce the light levels to that crop down below even more. But you also change the light quality. So now those plants in the basket are intercepting some of the red light and they're passing far red light through. The more far red light that hits that plant below, the more it's going to want to stretch. And also it can start to delay blooming. So you have to think about how much baskets you're putting over, how big those plants get, which crops are tending to stretch more, and which crops are going to also be more delayed in flowering. Again, the humidity issues. Can you vent? Do you have air circulation? Okay, can you get the crop up off the ground a little bit instead of putting it directly onto the ground cloth? That gives you some air movement underneath your containers. All these factors go into how you can control the growth, okay? And the choice of fertilizers, okay, your temperature, all right, all these aspects. So keep thinking of these as gas. If I can take some of the gas off the plant, then I don't need as much PGRs to control the growth. Another aspect that growers have to think about this is when they move plants. So here's another one. If you move plants from a warmer area to a cooler area and you hit that with a bonsai drench before you moved it, you will overdose your plants because that cooler temperature now slowed growth down. That bonsai is going to be even stronger. So you have to understand that when you start to change temperatures, you have to also look at how you're changing your growth regulator applications, or you're going to get too much or not enough, depending on what your temperature setting was. These are all things that you have to go through your head, okay? And it might explain why you lose control of some of your growth or you overdose something. And then obviously people have to throw crops all together. So, okay, I got all these different crops growing in a Quonset. You know, how am I going to control that? All right.
Excellent. Anything else? Anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask Dr. Styer?
All right, I'm going to ask one question. How many of you have used Floral or B9 Floral successfully? Or how many are not even using it? That was part of the talk, and I really think if you have not used Floral or B9 Floral, you really need to start to look at that because it does improve your branching. You need to do that around the time of your pinch. It may replace a pinch, it may not, but do it early in the crop to get that crop to branch better and also to delay flowering. But some crops, it'll delay flowering more, and it's in the talk. when we started looking at B9 Floral, we got an even better response of branching. And I think there's a slide in the talk showing you the effect on fuchsia. That is true. Plus, with the B9 being added to the floral, you get some growth control. So if you have not used it, you really should look at it because it's going to reduce some of your pinching. Typically, growers who are growing fuchsia baskets, especially if you're growing some of the older varieties, you're going to end up pinching that thing 3 times, once in prop and twice thereafter. This is going to reduce how many times you have to pinch that Floral basket. You just have to figure out you need at least 6 weeks between the last Floral and the time that you want to have that ready for sale. Calibacoa, we get some really nice Calibacoa baskets, well branched, and actually helps with the control. So one of these things that you see with crops like lantana, verbena, you get that 1 or 2 shoots that want to go straight out. It's more of a dominant shoot. So even though you pinched it okay, you get that dominant shoot, and now all of a sudden you have to use more growth regulator to try to control it. When you're doing your Floral or B9 Floral properly early on, you don't get that dominant shoot coming out so quickly. You get more shoots coming out more evenly, which results in a better branched plant, but also the flowers tend to be closer together. So now it looks like you have more flower power. Okay, then you put that guy together with a bonsai drench later on, and now you've got a really nice looking basket or a 4-inch container. So if you haven't played around with Floral, put it on your list for next spring. You have the information in the presentation to start using it. And then again, water pH is critical for Floral. You have to have it down to 5 or below for it to be active. It's probably the only chemical that is that critical for water pH.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else have any other questions before we conclude the live Q&A?
I've got one more. I had a customer last year who, with poinsettias, they were not, and you kind of touched on this earlier, they were not sizing up in time, and he got real nervous. So he went and sprayed a bunch of Progib on them, and he called me and sent me a picture, and he had this, it looked like, or could have sold it as a red rocket poinsettia. It had probably grown 8 inches or 10 inches, and nearly the whole thing was red. What would have caused that, and what would have been a better method to try to take care of that and make them saleable?
Okay, first off, Progib is straight GA, and it's awful hard to try to get the right rate without going overboard. And that's why the growers like to use Fascination or Fresco. Fascination or Fresco has a different GA in it. It's a GA 4+7, plus it has some cytokine in it. So it's a little bit more friendly to be able to use it and still get your stretch between the nodes, okay? You can tend to get, that will depend too on what the temperature is. You can get them to color up a little bit faster, but I've also seen guys delay a little bit. So that'll go back to, again, to temperature. If you're trying to use Fascination late in the crop, when it's already starting to color up to get more size, I would just say don't do it. Because what will happen is you're usually going to stretch between the bracts. And if you stretch between the bracts, you've got an ugly looking poinsettia that sell that crop. So if you're still behind on the size, and you're hitting the beginning of November, and your plants are already showing color, or they're showing bracts, not just transition bracts, don't do the Fascination. Try and make sure you can work the diff differently, giving them a positive diff instead of a negative dip in the morning. You can't do the feed because they're not going to respond to feed at that late stage, but it would be more concerned to get the bracts out and have a nice show. So when you're looking at poinsettia bract expansion, 68 degrees average daily temperature is the key. If you have 69 or 70 degree average daily temperature, the bracts will expand faster. If you're below 68 average daily temperature, you're going to delay bract expansion with varieties like Prestige. October is the typical month where growers don't do what they need to do to get the size, okay? If you're graphical tracking, which I always recommend every poinsettia grower to do graphical tracking, you'll know exactly where you're at. And you can still do some adjustments in October, either with your temperature, maybe with the fertilizer, but definitely with your fascination to get your size. All right. So again, late applications of fascination for size is not suggested. We can get a little bit more white in the bracts with a, but that's the only time I would ask growers to use it. But you better have control of the growth as well. Yeah, I can imagine what those poinsettias look like.
If I can find the picture, I'll send it to you. It was something fierce.
I can imagine. See, again, understand Progib is straight GA3, and it's really hard to get the right rate. So you're better off to use something like Fascination or Fresco to do that job.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If there aren't any more questions, we will conclude our live Q&A with Dr. Roger Styer. Once again, just thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact Carlin Horticultural Supplies or Roger. Would you like to share any of your contact info before we go? Just if anyone
Yeah.
has any follow-up.
Yeah, you can send me an email, and I think the email was at the end of the presentation also, at RC as in Charlie, STYER at ATT.net. I don't charge for phone calls or emails. Be more than happy to answer your questions. If you have some pictures of some problems, send them to me and I'll see if I can help you out. Okay?
Excellent, thank you. And I will make sure that this, we did record this presentation, this Q&A session, so I will make sure that is available for everyone to view at a later date if you would like to